At 61, Melissa Gilbert has finally broken her silence about the woman who changed her life, and the truth she's sharing about Patty Duke is not what anyone expected. For decades, fans knew Melissa as the bright-eyed girl from Little House on the Prairie, the symbol of innocence and warmth in a simpler television age. But behind the cameras, she was watching another kind of performance, one that would shape her understanding of fame, vulnerability, and survival. That performance came from Patty Duke. They first crossed paths when Gilbert was still a teenager, playing Helen Keller in The Miracle Worker. Patty, already a Hollywood legend, stepped into the role of Anne Sullivan, the mentor, both on screen and off. Yet what Melissa saw during those months of filming would stay with her for the rest of her life. Years later, she would realize that Patty Duke wasn't just teaching her how to act, she was teaching her how to endure. And now, with the weight of time and truth behind her, Melissa is finally revealing what she learned from the woman whose talent inspired her and whose pain mirrored her own. Before Melissa Gilbert ever met Patty Duke, her life already read like a script written inside the heart of Hollywood. She was born in 1964 in Los Angeles, then adopted by actor and comedian Paul Gilbert and his wife Barbara Crane. From her earliest days, sound stages and studio lights were as familiar as playgrounds. Her parents' friends were producers, musicians, and actors. Her babysitters were often working performers themselves. It was a world that promised magic but demanded perfection. Paul Gilbert recognized her spark early. He began taking her to auditions, not to chase fame, but to see if she belonged in that orbit. She did. Directors noticed the way she could listen, the way her eyes carried emotion before she spoke. Casting agents called her a natural, and soon, at just 9 years old, she landed a role that would define an era, Laura Ingalls Wilder in Little House on the Prairie. The show, based on the pioneer stories of Laura Ingalls Wilder, wasn't just another family drama. It became a cultural heartbeat of the 70s. A vision of decency and endurance at a time when the real world felt fractured. Week after week, Melissa was half pint, the daughter every family wished they had. Yet fame for a child is rarely simple. Michael Landon, both her on-screen father and real-life mentor, demanded professionalism and emotional truth. He pushed her to cry, to dig deeper, to feel every loss and triumph as if it were her own. She rose to the challenge, but each tear she shed on camera planted questions she was too young to answer. What happens when the cameras stop? What does it mean to carry other people's expectations when you're still trying to find yourself? The applause was constant. Awards followed. But inside, Melissa was learning that growing up under bright lights can blind you to your own needs. The set became her classroom. The scripts became her diary. Every smile, every emotional scene, every family dinner on screen built her public image, but also distanced her from the quiet girl who still just wanted to belong. By her late teens, she was no longer just America's sweetheart. She was an actress searching for something real beyond the roles. And that search, unknowingly, was leading her straight toward Patty Duke, another child star who had once walked the same fragile path, and who would soon teach Melissa what survival in Hollywood truly cost. By the late 1970s, Melissa Gilbert was no longer just the little girl from the Prairie. She was stepping into a new kind of challenge, one that would test her discipline, empathy, and understanding of what it meant to become a character. That test came with The Miracle Worker in 1979. It was a story the world already knew, but for Melissa it became something deeply personal. She was cast as Helen Keller, the blind and deaf girl who learned to communicate through sheer determination and love. Playing opposite her was Patty Duke, already an Academy Award winner, a Broadway veteran, and a woman who had once played Helen herself 2 decades earlier. This time, Patty took on the role of Anne Sullivan, Helen's teacher, mentor, and lifeline. On set, Melissa quickly realized she was standing beside a force of nature. Patty worked with precision, but there was something behind her eyes, an intensity that felt almost otherworldly. She demanded truth in every scene. She didn't want performance, she wanted reality. When Melissa struggled, Patty didn't soften. She pushed her harder. She told her to feel, not to act, to let the emotion find her instead of forcing it. Those lessons stayed long after the cameras stopped rolling. For the first time, Melissa began to understand the difference between pretending and becoming. She saw that great acting came from pain, from memory, from the parts of yourself that you'd rather keep hidden. There were days Patty's energy filled the room like electricity, and others when her mood turned quiet, even stormy. To a teenage Melissa, it was confusing, but fascinating. She didn't yet understand that what she was witnessing wasn't just artistic passion. It was the battle of a woman fighting through her own emotional storms, while still giving everything to her craft. When filming ended, Melissa left the project changed. Patty had become both a mirror and a mystery, someone who showed her the height an actor could reach and the cost of getting there. Decades later, when Melissa spoke about Patty Duke, it wasn't just with admiration. It was with gratitude for the lessons that went far beyond the screen, that strength doesn't always look graceful, that truth often comes from struggle, and that behind every extraordinary performance lies an ordinary person trying to survive their own life. That realization would return to Melissa years later, when fame, heartbreak, and addiction forced her to face her own version of those storms, and when Patty Duke's example once again quietly guided her through them. When Little House on the Prairie ended in 1983, Melissa Gilbert stood at a crossroads. Few child stars ever navigate safely. She had grown up on television, adored by millions, but once the show faded, so did the structure that had shaped her entire identity. The warmth and moral clarity that defined her screen life vanished the moment the lights went out. What replaced it was uncertainty, fame's quieter echo, and the question of who she was without a script. Hollywood didn't give her time to breathe. Offers kept coming, and Melissa accepted most of them, moving from one television film to another. Choices of the heart, family secrets, cries from the heart. Each role asked her to access deep emotions, often pain, grief, and loss. She became known for her seriousness, her ability to make viewers cry. But away from the cameras, that emotional weight began to accumulate. The boundaries between character and self blurred. She carried other people's heartbreak long after the closing credits. As she moved into adulthood, Melissa began to see the darker undercurrents of the industry that had raised her. The same world that once celebrated her innocence now demanded reinvention. Casting directors wanted sophistication but still expected her to remain the girl next door. It was a contradiction she couldn't live up to. Publicly, she smiled through interviews, polished and gracious. Privately, she felt the same isolation she'd once sensed in Patty Duke. She remembered those moments on the Miracle Worker set, the mood swings, the flashes of brilliance shadowed by exhaustion, and realized she understood them now. The pressure to please, the fear of losing relevance, the need to hide pain behind performance. By her 20s, Melissa had become a mirror of what Hollywood does best and worst. It creates icons, then forgets they're human. She faced failed relationships, self-doubt, and the creeping sense that success had come too early. Fame, she realized, doesn't grow with you. It freezes you in time. Still, she kept working. Acting wasn't just her career, it was her language, the only way she knew how to make sense of life. But even as she built a resume filled with impressive performances, she carried a quiet awareness that something essential was missing. She needed purpose, not applause. Meaning, not image. That longing would lead her to unexpected places, into leadership, into motherhood, and eventually into the painful honesty of memoir. Yet the lessons that shaped those choices were rooted in what she had witnessed in Patty Duke, a brilliant artist who had suffered deeply and kept moving forward. Melissa's real education in survival was only beginning, and the cost of growing up famous would soon reveal its full weight. When Melissa Gilbert first worked with Patty Duke, she saw brilliance wrapped in unpredictability, Patty could shift from warmth to fury in a heartbeat, then back again as if nothing had changed. At the time, Melissa interpreted it as artistic passion, the temperament of a perfectionist. Only years later would she realize that what she had witnessed was something far more serious. A woman silently waging war with her own mind. As Melissa matured, she learned what the public did not yet know. Patty Duke had lived most of her youth under manipulation, exploitation, and emotional chaos. Fame had not brought her joy, it had magnified her pain. Diagnosed with bipolar disorder years later, Duke became one of the first Hollywood figures to speak openly about mental illness, refusing to hide behind the polished image expected of her. For Melissa, that revelation reframed everything she remembered about their time together. The volatility she once feared was now understood as exhaustion, not cruelty. The intensity in Duke's eyes wasn't arrogance, it was survival. Patty had been performing even when the cameras were off, holding herself together for everyone else's comfort. In interviews, Melissa later admitted she wished she had known then what she knows now. She might have offered understanding instead of distance, compassion instead of confusion. But in her teenage years, no one talked about these things. Silence was the rule in Hollywood, and vulnerability was weakness. Watching Patty later in life, unfiltered and candid about her illness, gave Melissa a new model of strength. Patty wasn't just surviving, she was teaching others how to live with honesty. She showed that courage doesn't always look triumphant. Sometimes it looks like a woman refusing to pretend any longer. Melissa began to see parallels between Patty's openness and her own growing need to stop hiding behind her career. The entertainment world taught both women to smile through pain, to give interviews filled with optimism, even when their lives were unraveling. Patty shattered that illusion first. She told the truth, and that truth became Melissa's quiet blueprint for the years to come. By the time Gilbert reached her 40s, she fully grasped what Patty had endured and what it had cost her to speak out. Duke's courage made Melissa reevaluate her own silence. The secrets about addiction, heartbreak, and self-doubt she had carried for decades. Patty Duke had unknowingly given her permission to tell the truth. And when Melissa finally chose to do that, she did it the same way Patty had, fearlessly, without apology, and with the belief that truth can heal what fame once fractured. As the years passed, Melissa Gilbert began to see her own reflection in Patty Duke's story. The patterns were hauntingly similar: early fame, relentless pressure, and the quiet erosion of personal peace behind public success. Patty's life had once seemed like a warning. Now it felt like a mirror. Melissa's 20s were filled with success on screen, but chaos in private. The constant attention that had once felt validating now felt suffocating. She had learned to perform stability, to smile, to reassure fans she was fine, even when she wasn't. Beneath that mask she carried loneliness and exhaustion, the same quiet struggles she had once seen in Patty's eyes. She married actor Bo Brinkman in 1988, believing love might offer the grounding fame never could. They had a son, Dakota, in 1989, and for a while she thought she had found the peace she'd been searching for. But the cracks soon showed. Arguments deepened, trust faltered, and Hollywood's distractions crept into their marriage. When it ended in 1994, Melissa felt the same emptiness she'd seen consume others before her. Just a year later, she found herself drawn to Bruce Boxleitner, another actor, another familiar rhythm. Their relationship began with hope, but carried its own weight of expectations. They built a blended family, and even named their son Michael Garrett, after her mentor, Michael Landon. It was a tribute born of love and loss. Yet, behind that tenderness, old habits lingered, working to exhaustion, sacrificing personal stillness for professional momentum, trying to live up to an image she had long outgrown. By her 40s, Melissa had reached a breaking point. Addiction, health scares, and emotional fatigue forced her to confront everything she had avoided. She began therapy, faced her dependencies, and stripped away the illusions that had protected her since childhood. And in that raw confrontation, Patty Duke's example came rushing back. Patty had chosen honesty over image. She had dared to let the world see her flaws, her pain, her humanity. Melissa realized she could do the same. The woman she had once admired for her acting was now teaching her how to survive, not as a celebrity, but as a person. Gilbert later said that Patty's openness about mental health made her brave enough to tell her own story, to write it down without polish or pretense. What began as a memoir became a confession, and what might have been shame turned into strength. In many ways, Patty Duke had become the mentor she never knew she still needed. Her resilience showed Melissa that redemption doesn't come from forgetting your past, but from facing it head-on. Both women had lived under the same merciless spotlight, and both learned, in time, that real healing begins only when the performance ends. When Melissa Gilbert chose to tell her story publicly, it wasn't out of nostalgia or self-promotion, it was survival. The years of smiling through exhaustion, of crafting a perfect version of herself for cameras and headlines, had left her hollow. Patty Duke's fearlessness had planted a seed long before, and by the time Melissa sat down to write her memoir, she was finally ready to live without disguise. Her book, Prairie, released in 2009, shocked readers who thought they knew her. She wrote about addiction, heartbreak, and the price of perfection. There were no excuses, no filters, no attempt to protect her public image. For the first time, Melissa didn't write to please, she wrote to heal. And in doing so, she joined a lineage of women like Patty Duke, who refused to let silence be their legacy. But honesty came with risk. The entertainment world had always rewarded polished optimism. Vulnerability, especially from women, was still treated as weakness. Yet Gilbert stood firm. She wasn't a child star anymore. She was a survivor telling her truth. That honesty stripped of glamour became the most powerful role she'd ever played. Her courage didn't stop at memoir. From 2001 to 2005, she served as president of the Screen Actors Guild, fighting for fair pay, health coverage, and safer working conditions. The same empathy that had once drawn her to Patty's pain now fueled her leadership. She had learned to use her voice, not as a performer, but as an advocate. During those years, she often reflected on Patty Duke's legacy. Duke had spent decades breaking barriers around mental health, urging others to face their pain instead of burying it. Melissa carried that spirit forward, using her platform to show that transparency was strength, not scandal. In the years that followed, she found a quieter rhythm. Marriage to Timothy Busfield in 2013 brought a steadiness she had long been missing. Together they stepped away from Hollywood's chaos and built a slower, more grounded life in Michigan. There, away from the red carpets and studio lights, Melissa discovered peace, renovating an old house, writing again, and reconnecting with the person she had been before fame. It wasn't retreat, it was renewal, and every time she was asked about Patty Duke, she spoke not of tragedy, but of transformation. Patty's bravery had shown her that healing isn't about erasing the past, it's about owning it. Melissa Gilbert had finally learned that authenticity carries more power than any performance, and the more she embraced that truth, the more she realized how deeply Patty Duke's courage had shaped her own. By the time Melissa Gilbert reached 61, the connection she felt to Patty Duke had transformed from admiration into understanding. Time had softened the confusion she once felt and replaced it with empathy. When she finally spoke publicly about Patty, it wasn't to revisit the past, it was to honor what that woman had unknowingly given her: a map for survival. Melissa described Patty as one of the most fearless actresses she had ever known. What struck her most wasn't the performances that won awards, but the raw humanity behind them. Patty's honesty on screen wasn't technique, it was truth. She lived her emotions openly, sometimes painfully, and in doing so gave others permission to do the same. When Melissa looked back on her own life, the fame, The marriages, the breakdowns, the comebacks. She recognized pieces of Patty everywhere. They had both been molded by an industry that prized perfection, then punished vulnerability. Yet both women, in the end, chose truth over illusion. Patty Duke had once stood before the world and admitted that she lived with bipolar disorder, a revelation that changed how Hollywood spoke about mental health. For Melissa, that act of courage became a turning point. It taught her that silence protects the lie, not the person. It showed her that speaking out doesn't destroy a legacy, it redeems it. In her 60s, Gilbert began to use her own voice in the same spirit. Whether in interviews, writings, or quiet moments with fans, she refused to hide the scars that fame had left behind. She spoke about aging, about imperfection, about resilience, and in every word there was a quiet echo of Patty's influence, a reminder that truth once spoken doesn't fade. Melissa often said Patty wasn't just a legend or a cautionary tale, she was human. She wanted love, safety, and peace, the same things everyone wants, no matter how bright the spotlight. That realization became Melissa's compass. It allowed her to forgive herself for past mistakes, to stop chasing the impossible image of who Hollywood expected her to be. In breaking her silence, Melissa did more than remember a friend. She closed a circle. The journey of one woman who had once learned from another how to act, now learning from her how to live. Patty's greatest gift wasn't inspiration. It was freedom. The freedom to tell the truth, to embrace imperfection, and to keep walking forward no matter how heavy the past. And for Melissa Gilbert, that was the miracle Patty Duke left behind. Not on film, but in the lives of those she quietly saved. Melissa Gilbert's decision to finally speak about Patty Duke was never meant as revelation for headlines. It was reflection, a closing of distance between two women who had walked parallel roads through the same unforgiving world. What Melissa shared at 61 wasn't gossip or nostalgia, it was gratitude. She looked back on the girl who once stood opposite Patty on the set of The Miracle Worker and realized how little she had understood then. Patty wasn't only teaching her how to act, she was showing her what endurance looked like. Years later, Melissa recognized that the lessons of compassion, honesty, and courage had shaped every chapter of her own life. Patty's openness about her struggles changed the landscape for performers who came after her, and Melissa carried that torch forward. She had learned that telling the truth, even when uncomfortable, frees you from the roles others assign. It allows you to live on your own terms. So when Melissa finally broke her silence, she did it to honor not just Patty Duke, but every artist who learned to survive in a world built on illusion. Her words were simple yet powerful. Our struggles shape us, and by sharing them we remind others they're not alone. For more emotional stories, check out this video.